Imagine a quiet village in medieval Europe. The morning sun has only just begun to rise. A thin layer of mist hangs above the fields. Smoke slowly curls from stone chimneys. Most mornings, the villagers would already be hard at work. The blacksmith would light his forge. Farmers would walk toward their fields. Bakers would begin preparing the day's bread. Life followed a familiar rhythm. But every so often, that rhythm would gently change. The church bells would begin to ring. Their sound carried across the rooftops, through the narrow streets, and into every home. It was a gentle reminder that this was no ordinary day. It was a festival. For people living in medieval Europe, festivals were among the brightest moments of the entire year. They brought neighbors together, filled village squares with music, covered long wooden tables with food, and gave people a welcome pause from the demands of everyday life. Tonight, we'll quietly step back through the centuries and spend some time exploring what those medieval festivals were really like. In many ways, medieval life was shaped by the seasons. Spring brought new growth. Summer was filled with long days of work. Autumn was a time for gathering the harvest. And winter often encouraged people to remain close to home. For most villagers, there was always something waiting to be done. Fields needed tending. Animals needed care. Wood had to be gathered before the cold arrived. Life moved at a steady pace. Simple, yet demanding. It is perhaps for this reason that festivals held such a special place in everyday life. They offered something quite rare. A gentle pause. For a little while, work became less important. Neighbors had time to visit one another. Families gathered around long wooden tables. Children played freely in the village square. Even those who lived many miles apart often found themselves meeting again during these celebrations. Many festivals were connected to the Christian calendar. Others celebrated the changing of the seasons. Some honored local saints, while others marked the successful gathering of the year's harvest. Whatever the occasion, the village slowly transformed. The quiet streets became lively. Homes were carefully prepared. Fresh bread filled the ovens. Ale was brewed. Colorful banners were hung wherever they could be seen. And before the first visitor arrived, before the musicians played their opening notes, before the laughter echoed through the streets, there was one familiar sound: the church bells. Their gentle ringing reminded everyone that another festival had quietly begun. As the morning continued, people began arriving from the surrounding countryside. Some came on foot. Others traveled by horse and cart. Many had been walking since sunrise. For families living in small villages, a festival was more than a celebration. It was an opportunity to see familiar faces once again. Friends who lived several miles away. Relatives who visited only a few times each year. Traveling merchants who carried goods from distant towns. The village square slowly filled with life. Wooden stalls were carefully arranged. Colorful fabrics fluttered gently in the breeze. Fresh loaves of bread were placed on rough wooden tables. Wheels of cheese. Clay pots filled with honey. Bundles of herbs. And baskets overflowing with apples and pears. The air itself seemed different. The comforting smell of baking bread mixed with wood smoke. Nearby, a large fire quietly crackled. Before long, the first musicians began tuning their instruments. A wooden flute, a small drum, perhaps a fiddle. Simple melodies drifted through the square. Children gathered to listen. Some began to dance. Others simply watched with quiet curiosity. There was no great stage, no loud speakers, no fireworks lighting the sky. Only neighbors, sharing a peaceful day together. And for many people, that was more than enough. Others traveled by horse and cart. Many had been walking since sunrise. For families living in small villages, a festival was more than a celebration. It was an opportunity to see familiar faces once again. Friends who lived several miles away. Relatives who visited only a few times each year. Traveling merchants who carried goods from distant towns. The village square slowly filled with life. Wooden stalls were carefully arranged. Colorful fabrics fluttered gently in the breeze. Fresh loaves of bread were placed on rough wooden tables. Wheels of cheese. Clay pots filled with honey. Bundles of herbs. And baskets overflowing with apples and pears. The air itself seemed different. The comforting smell of baking bread mixed with wood smoke. Nearby, a large fire quietly crackled. Before long, the first musicians began tuning their instruments. A wooden flute, a small drum, perhaps a fiddle. Simple melodies drifted through the square. Children gathered to listen. Some began to dance. Others simply watched with quiet curiosity. There was no great stage, no loud speakers, no fireworks lighting the sky. Only neighbors, sharing a peaceful day together. And for many people, that was more than enough. Winter arrived quietly. The fields rested beneath a blanket of frost. The trees stood bare against the pale sky. The days became shorter, and the nights seemed wonderfully long. For medieval families, this was a season spent close to the warmth of home. Wood crackled gently inside stone fireplaces. Simple meals were shared around wooden tables. Candles flickered softly against rough walls. Outside, the village rested beneath the silence of winter. But as Christmas approached, that silence slowly gave way to quiet excitement. For Christians across medieval Europe, Christmas was among the most cherished celebrations of the year. The weeks before it were a time of preparation. Churches were carefully cleaned. Candles were made ready. Special foods were prepared whenever families could afford them. Those with little often shared what they had. Neighbors helped one another, and travelers were welcomed with kindness. On Christmas Eve, the village church became the heart of the community. Long before sunrise, people wrapped themselves in heavy woolen cloaks. Lanterns glowed softly along narrow paths. Families walked together, their footsteps gently crunching across frozen ground. Inside the church, hundreds of tiny candle flames filled the darkness with a warm golden light. Voices rose together in quiet prayer. The scent of burning beeswax lingered in the cool air. For a little while, the worries of daily life seemed very far away. When the service had ended, The celebration quietly continued at home. Simple bread, warm pottage, roasted meats for those fortunate enough to have them, fresh ale, honey cakes, and perhaps a few peaceful hours with family and friends. It was not a celebration of great luxury, but of warmth, gratitude, and togetherness. As winter slowly faded, the landscape began to change. Tiny green shoots appeared beneath the trees. The days grew a little longer. Birdsong returned to the mornings. And with the arrival of spring, another important season quietly approached. For medieval Christians, this was the time of Lent, a period of reflection, prayer, and simplicity. For 40 days, many people chose to eat more modest meals. Rich foods were set aside. Life became a little quieter. It was a season that encouraged patience and gratitude. As Lent drew to a close, the village once again prepared for one of the most meaningful celebrations of the entire year. Easter. On Good Friday, the mood was calm and thoughtful. Church bells rang more softly. Many families spent time in prayer. The village streets, usually filled with cheerful conversation, seemed unusually peaceful. People remembered the final hours of Jesus Christ. Candles burned quietly inside the church, their gentle light reflecting across ancient stone walls. Then, as Easter Sunday arrived, everything seemed to brighten once again. The church bells rang joyfully across the countryside. Families greeted one another with warm smiles. Children laughed as they played outside beneath the spring sunshine. After weeks of simple meals, tables were once again filled with freshly baked bread, roasted meats, cheese, eggs, and sweet pastries prepared especially for the celebration. For many villagers, Easter was more than a feast. It was a reminder that after every long winter, spring always returned, and with it, hope. By midday, the village no longer felt quite the same. The quiet lanes, usually traveled only by farmers and merchants, had become places of laughter, conversation, and gentle music. Near the center of the square, traveling musicians gathered together. One carried a wooden flute, another played a small harp. A drummer kept a slow and steady rhythm. Their melodies were simple. Many had been passed from one generation to the next. There were no written concert programs, no grand performances, only familiar songs that almost everyone knew by heart. Nearby, storytellers began to gather small crowds. Children sat quietly on the grass. Parents listened from a short distance away. The stories were often well known. Tales of brave knights, wise kings, faithful saints, or wonderful adventures that had traveled across Europe for centuries. Not every festival was loud. Many moments were surprisingly peaceful. Friends who had not seen one another for months sat together on wooden benches. Neighbors shared warm bread. A traveler described distant towns and unfamiliar landscapes. For a little while, the village became something more than a place to live. It became a place to simply enjoy being together. As the afternoon slowly passed, The celebrations continued at an unhurried pace. There was nowhere important to be, nothing urgent waiting at home. Only the gentle feeling that this day was meant to be shared. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, the familiar aroma of cooking filled the village once again. Large iron pots hung above open fires. Steam rose gently into the cool air. Women carried fresh loaves of bread from nearby ovens. Children waited patiently, watching every meal being prepared. For many families, festival days offered foods that were rarely enjoyed during ordinary weeks. A loaf of freshly baked white bread, instead of the darker everyday loaves. A little more cheese, perhaps roasted pork, or a goose, if the household had been fortunate enough to save one for the occasion. Bowls of thick vegetable pottage still appeared on many tables. Simple meals remained an important part of village life. But today, there was just a little more to share. Honey was stirred into cakes. Apples were baked beside the fire. Ale was poured into wooden cups. And warm laughter traveled from one table to another. Nobody hurried through the meal. There was time for conversation, time for stories, time simply to enjoy the company of family, neighbors, and old friends. As daylight slowly softened, the sounds of the village became quieter once again. The musicians continued to play. But now, their melodies seemed slower, gentler, as though the day itself was preparing to come to a peaceful close. As evening slowly settled across the countryside, the golden light of the afternoon began to fade. Long shadows stretched across the village square. The day's warmth gave way to the cool air of the approaching night. One by one, lanterns were lit outside homes. Their gentle glow flickered against timber walls. In the center of the village, a great bonfire was carefully prepared. Not every festival included one, but when it did, people gathered around its welcoming warmth. Children sat close to their parents. Older villagers found familiar places on wooden benches. Travelers rested after long journeys. There was no rush to leave. No clocks reminding anyone of the hour. Time seemed to move a little more gently. The musicians continued to play. Their lively tunes now softened into slower melodies. Some villagers quietly sang together. Others simply listened, looking into the dancing flames. Above them, the night sky slowly revealed itself. Without electric lights, the stars appeared brighter than most of us have ever known. The Milky Way stretched silently across the heavens. Constellations guided travelers, and the moon cast a silver light over fields that had grown quiet once more. Before returning home, many families visited the village church one final time. A short evening prayer, a moment of gratitude, a few peaceful words spoken together. Then, lantern in hand, they made their way through the silent streets. Tomorrow, the fields would still be waiting. The animals would still need feeding. Life would quietly return to its familiar rhythm. But for one beautiful day, the village had celebrated together. And perhaps that was the greatest gift these festivals offered. Not riches, not luxury, but the simple comfort of belonging. As the last lanterns disappeared into the darkness, the village slowly became quiet once more. The music had faded. The laughter had become distant. Only the gentle crackling of the dying fire could still be heard. Above the rooftops, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky. One festival had quietly come to an end. But the year itself was only beginning its journey. Beyond the winter, spring would slowly return. The fields would awaken once again. New seeds would be planted. Children would grow a little taller. The seasons would continue their gentle rhythm, just as they always had. And with every changing season, another festival would patiently wait. Another gathering. Another ringing of church bells. Another day when ordinary life would pause, and neighbors would once again come together. Our journey through medieval festivals is only just beginning. Chapter 2. As one festival quietly came to an end, life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The market stalls disappeared. The musicians continued their travels. The village square became peaceful once more. Yet everyone knew another celebration would eventually arrive. Throughout the year, the lives of medieval Christians were gently guided by the church calendar. The passing of the seasons and the passing of sacred days were closely connected. People did not simply measure time by months or by numbers written on a page. Instead, many remembered the year through its festivals. The Feast of Easter, the Feast of Pentecost, Michaelmas, Christmas, the Feast of All Saints, each one quietly marking another step in the journey of the year. Long before clocks became common, or calendars hung upon kitchen walls, the ringing of church bells reminded people that another sacred season had arrived. The village church stood at the heart of nearly every community. Its tower could often be seen from the surrounding fields. Its bells could be heard for miles. For many villagers, the sound became as familiar as birdsong. It welcomed newborn children, celebrated marriages, mourned those who had passed away, and called entire communities together. During every important festival, inside, the church was unlike anywhere else in the village. Thick stone walls kept the air cool. Colorful light filtered gently through stained glass windows. Candles flickered quietly before painted images of saints. The scent of beeswax, mixed with incense, created an atmosphere unlike ordinary life. For many people, this was the most beautiful place they would ever enter. It was here that festivals truly began. Not with feasting, not with music, but with prayer. Families gathered side by side. Farmers, millers, blacksmiths, merchants, children standing beside their parents, old neighbors greeting one another with warm smiles. For a little while, the worries of work, harvests, and uncertain weather were quietly set aside. The village became one community, joined together in faith. Only after these peaceful moments would the celebrations beyond the church doors slowly begin. The first great celebration many medieval families looked forward to arrived in the quiet heart of winter. Christmas. By the time it approached, The countryside had grown still. The fields rested beneath frost. The trees stood bare against pale skies. The long hours of harvest were now only distant memories. For many families, winter offered something they rarely enjoyed during the busiest months of the year: time together. Preparations began many days before the celebration itself. Homes were carefully swept. Fresh rushes were spread across wooden floors. Candles were made ready. Those who could afford it saved their finest food for the feast. For others, the celebration remained simple: a warm loaf of bread, a pot gently simmering above the fire, perhaps a little cheese, or dried fruit carefully kept aside for this special season. Whatever the meal, it was shared with gratitude. As Christmas Eve arrived, the village slowly became quieter than usual. Smoke drifted peacefully from every chimney. Lanterns appeared beside narrow doorways. Families wrapped themselves in heavy woolen cloaks. And together, they began the familiar walk toward the village church. The path was often lit only by moonlight. Footsteps pressed softly into frozen earth. Their quiet conversation soon gave way to silence. As the church came into view, its windows glowed warmly against the winter darkness. Inside, hundreds of small candle flames gently illuminated the ancient stone walls. Their light danced across carved wooden beams, painted saints, and colored glass that had watched over countless generations before them. The air carried the gentle fragrance of beeswax, mixed with the faint scent of evergreen branches placed around the church for the season. Voices rose together in peaceful prayer. Not hurried, not loud, but steady, warm, and familiar. For many villagers, this quiet gathering was the true beginning of Christmas. When the prayers had quietly come to an end, no one hurried home. The celebration was only beginning. Outside the church, neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Children, who had waited patiently through the service, now laughed as they hurried across the village square. The cold winter air carried the comforting scent of wood smoke. Some families returned to homes that had been warming beside the fire all evening. Others were invited to share the celebration with relatives or close friends. Hospitality was deeply valued, especially during Christmas. A place at the table was often found for travelers, the elderly, or anyone who might otherwise have spent the evening alone. Inside the home, the fire burned brightly. Its gentle warmth filled the room. Heavy cloaks were carefully hung beside the doorway. Frozen hands slowly became warm again. The meal itself was never the same in every household. A wealthy family might enjoy roasted goose, venison, fresh bread, cheese, spiced wine, and sweet pastries flavored with honey. Most villagers lived far more simply. Yet Christmas remained a day when even modest tables felt special. Fresh bread, a warm stew, a little ale, perhaps a small honey cake saved for the occasion. The value of the meal was rarely measured by its richness, but by the people gathered around it. Stories were shared. Children listened as grandparents remembered Christmases from many years before. Neighbors spoke of the passing seasons, of good harvests, hard winters, new babies, old friends no longer present. Outside, snow sometimes continued to fall in complete silence. Inside, the fire quietly crackled beside the family, and for a few peaceful hours, the worries of everyday life seemed wonderfully distant. There were no fields waiting to be plowed, no markets to visit, no journeys to make before sunrise. Only warmth, conversation, and the comforting feeling of being home. By the following morning, the village seemed to awaken a little more slowly than usual. Thin ribbons of smoke rose peacefully from the chimneys. Fresh footprints crossed the snow-covered paths. Some families visited neighbors. Others welcomed guests into their homes. Children, wrapped in thick woolen cloaks, found small ways to entertain themselves outdoors. There were no toys made of plastic, no brightly colored wrapping paper, no electric lights shining from every window. Yet Christmas was no less meaningful. Its greatest gifts were often the simplest: a shared meal, a warm fire, a familiar face, a peaceful day spent together. As the winter weeks quietly passed, the celebrations gradually came to an end. The candles burned a little shorter. The last of the festive food was carefully eaten. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The blacksmith reopened his forge. Farmers once again cared for their animals. The village settled back into its ordinary routines. But the church calendar never remained still for long. The seasons continued to turn. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. The first green shoots appeared across the fields. The songs of birds returned to the mornings. And with the arrival of new life, another sacred season quietly approached. The season of Easter. Spring arrived almost quietly. At first, only a few small signs appeared. Tiny flowers pushed their way through the earth. The trees slowly exchanged bare branches for fresh green leaves. Streams that had rested beneath winter ice began to flow freely once again. For people living in medieval Europe, these gentle changes were deeply comforting. They marked the end of another long winter, the return of longer days, and the beginning of new work in the fields. As the countryside came back to life, the church also entered one of its most important seasons, Lent. For 40 days, many Christians prepared themselves for Easter. Life became a little quieter. Meals often became simpler. Some families chose to set aside meat. Others spent more time in prayer. It was not intended to be a season of sadness. Rather, it was a season of reflection. A time to slow down, to think, and to prepare for the celebration that lay ahead. As Lent drew to its close, the atmosphere throughout the village began to change once more. Churches were carefully cleaned. Fresh flowers appeared beside the altar. Candles were replaced. Choirs quietly rehearsed hymns that had been sung for generations. Every small preparation was made with care. Everyone knew that Easter was drawing near, and with it, one of the most joyful mornings of the entire year. Good Friday arrived with a different feeling. The village seemed quieter than it had been only a few days before. The cheerful conversations of the marketplace were replaced by quieter voices. Many families dressed in their best clothing, not for celebration, but for worship. As morning light spread across the rooftops, the church bells rang with a slower rhythm. Their sound drifted across the fields, carried gently by the spring breeze. People made their way toward the church, walking together along familiar paths. Some carried small prayer books. Others simply walked in thoughtful silence. Inside, the church felt much as it always had. The cool stone beneath their feet, the gentle fragrance of beeswax candles, the colored light resting quietly upon ancient walls. Yet the atmosphere was different. The songs were softer. The prayers lingered a little longer. The service invited people to remember the final hours of Jesus Christ. Many listened with bowed heads. Others quietly reflected upon the passing of another year. When the service ended, the village remained peaceful. There was no great feast waiting at home. No lively music in the square. The quietness itself became part of the day. Only after this time of reflection would Easter morning slowly arrive, and with it, the gentle return of celebration. When Easter morning finally arrived, the village seemed almost transformed. The same narrow streets, the same familiar cottages, the same fields stretching into the distance, now rested beneath the gentle light of early spring. The air felt softer. Birdsong returned to the trees. Fresh blossoms appeared beside winding paths. Nature itself seemed to be quietly awakening. Before long, the church bells rang once again. Their joyful sound traveled across the countryside. Families stepped outside their homes. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Children, who had waited patiently through the long weeks of Lent, now laughed freely as they crossed the village square. Inside the church, sunlight poured through stained glass windows. Colors of blue, red, and gold rested gently upon the ancient stone floor. Fresh flowers decorated the altar. The hymns that filled the church carried a lighter spirit than those of only 2 days before. There was a quiet feeling of renewal, not hurried excitement, but peaceful gratitude. When the service came to its close, the celebration slowly continued beyond the church doors. Families returned home together. The scent of fresh bread drifted once more through the village. Eggs, carefully saved during the weeks of Lent, now appeared on many tables. Roasted meats returned. Sweet pastries flavored with honey and spices were shared among neighbors. Children wandered happily through gardens and fields, enjoying the first truly warm days of the year. Older villagers found comfortable places beneath the spring sunshine. Stories were exchanged. Laughter quietly returned. And for a little while, the long winter felt wonderfully far away. As the afternoon unfolded, the celebration found its own gentle rhythm. There was no carefully planned schedule, no loud announcements, no crowds rushing from one event to another. People simply allowed the day to unfold naturally. Some families wandered slowly through the village. Others visited grandparents or neighbors they had not seen for many weeks. Children rarely stayed in one place for very long. They explored gardens, watched birds building nests beneath cottage roofs, collected smooth stones from nearby streams, or chased one another through fields that had only recently begun to turn green again. Older villagers preferred quieter moments. Many sat beneath the warm spring sunshine, watching the younger generations fill the village with laughter. Some spoke softly about harvests yet to come. Others remembered Easters from many years before. The passing of time was never something to fear. It was simply part of life. Around them, nature continued its quiet work. Bees moved patiently between blossoms. Lambs wandered close beside their mothers. Fresh leaves shimmered gently whenever the breeze passed through the trees. To medieval people, the return of spring was more than a change in the weather. It was something they could see, hear, and feel, everywhere around them. Perhaps that is why Easter carried such deep meaning, not only inside the church, but across the fields, the forests, the rivers, and every quiet corner of the countryside. For a little while, the entire landscape seemed to celebrate alongside them. Although Christmas and Easter were among the most widely celebrated festivals, they were not the only days that brought a village together. As the months quietly passed, the church calendar continued to guide the rhythm of the year. Almost every season offered another reason to gather. Some villages honored their patron saint. Others celebrated the end of planting, or gave thanks when the harvest had safely been gathered. Each community developed traditions that were passed from parents to children for countless generations. On the morning of these feast days, the village awakened with a quiet sense of anticipation. The church bells once again welcomed the day. Doors slowly opened. Neighbors greeted one another as they walked through familiar streets. Before long, the village square became filled with gentle conversation. Traveling merchants often chose these occasions to visit. Their wooden carts carried objects rarely seen in small villages: brightly colored cloth, handmade pottery, fine knives, wooden toys, fresh spices from distant lands. For many children, simply walking through the market felt like an adventure. Every stall offered something different. Every traveler brought another story. People paused not only to buy, but to listen. A merchant might describe a great city beyond the mountains. A pilgrim might speak of an ancient monastery. A sailor might tell stories of distant seas. Few villagers would ever see for themselves. For a little while, the world seemed much larger than the fields surrounding their own homes. As the afternoon continued, the village square slowly became a place of quiet amusement. Near one corner, a traveling minstrel adjusted the strings of his small harp. Beside him, another musician carefully lifted a wooden flute. The first notes drifted softly into the afternoon air. The melodies were simple. Many had been played for generations. Some told stories of ancient kings. Others remembered faithful saints. Many celebrated the changing seasons, or the beauty of the countryside itself. There were no grand stages, no rows of seats. People simply gathered wherever they found a comfortable place. Some remained standing. Others rested upon low stone walls. Children settled cross-legged upon the grass, listening. even if they did not fully understand every word. Not far away, another small crowd had begun to gather. An elderly storyteller stood beneath the shade of a large oak tree. He spoke slowly, pausing often, allowing every tale to unfold at its own gentle pace. His stories traveled through distant forests, across quiet monasteries, into castles, and forgotten villages. Sometimes they told of courage, sometimes of kindness, sometimes they simply invited listeners to imagine another world beyond their own. Few people hurried away. The stories themselves were part of the celebration. For many villagers, these traveling musicians and storytellers offered something wonderfully rare. A glimpse of places they would probably never visit. And for a little while, the world seemed just a little larger than it had that morning. As the gentle music drifted across the square, other forms of entertainment quietly found their place. A small circle of children gathered nearby, not around a grand performance, but around a traveling puppeteer. His stage was little more than a wooden frame, covered by a simple cloth. From behind it, tiny carved figures appeared one by one. A king, a knight, a farmer, a mischievous fox. Each moved with surprising life. Their stories were familiar. Their endings often carried gentle lessons. The children watched with quiet delight. Even many of the adults found themselves smiling. A little farther along, young men gathered for friendly competitions. There were no great prizes waiting, only the simple satisfaction of testing one's skill. Some practiced archery, patiently drawing longbows toward distant straw targets. Others challenged friends to wrestling matches upon soft grass. The contests were lively, yet seldom unfriendly. Laughter followed both victory and defeat. Older villagers often watched from nearby benches, offering quiet advice, or recalling similar competitions from their own youth. There was no pressure to be the strongest or the fastest. The games were simply another reason to spend the day together. As the afternoon stretched onward, the celebration never seemed hurried. Some people wandered through the market once again. Others returned to listen to another story. Children discovered new games with friends they had only just met. The hours passed gently, almost unnoticed, like the slow movement of clouds across a spring sky. As the sun slowly began its journey toward the western horizon, the pace of the festival softened once again. The busiest hours had gently passed. Many visitors had found comfortable places to rest beneath the shade of old trees. Some shared quiet conversation. Others simply watched the life of the village unfold before them. Near the edge of the square, several craftsmen continued their work. A potter carefully shaped wet clay upon a spinning wheel. Patient hands slowly transformed soft earth into bowls, jugs, and simple cups. Not far away, a woodcarver sat upon a small stool. Thin curls of fresh wood gathered around his feet. With every careful movement, another toy, another spoon, or another small carving quietly took shape. Children often stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. To them, it almost seemed like magic. A simple piece of wood, gradually becoming something beautiful. The blacksmith's forge, usually one of the busiest places in the village, burned a little more gently today. Even he allowed himself moments of conversation between his work. Neighbors paused to greet him. Travelers admired his tools. Young apprentices listened carefully, hoping to learn something new. These festivals were not only times of celebration. They were also times of learning. Skills were shared. Ideas traveled from village to village. New tools appeared. Different ways of baking, building, or farming were quietly exchanged through ordinary conversation. Without books, without newspapers, and without the internet, festivals became one of the most important ways for knowledge itself to travel across medieval Europe. As daylight slowly began to fade, the marketplace grew a little quieter. One by one, merchants carefully packed their remaining goods. Wooden crates were closed. Canvas coverings were folded. The horses that had patiently waited throughout the day were prepared for the journey home. Some travelers still had many miles ahead of them. Others would remain in the village until morning. For many families, the departure of the merchants always carried a quiet feeling. The festival itself was gently drawing to a close. Yet there was still time for one final gathering. As evening settled across the countryside, neighbors once again found their way toward the village square. A few lanterns had already been lit. Their warm glow rested softly upon the timber-framed houses. Children sat close beside their parents. The youngest, now growing sleepy after a long day of excitement. The musicians returned once more. Their lively melodies from the afternoon had become slower, more peaceful. The sound of the flute drifted gently through the cool evening air. A quiet harp answered nearby. No one hurried the music. No one asked for another performance. The melodies simply rose, then slowly disappeared into the evening. Some villagers quietly joined together in song. Their voices were calm, unhurried, familiar. Songs their parents had once taught them, and their grandparents before them. Above the rooftops, the first evening stars quietly appeared. The warmth of the day slowly faded. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and distant woodland. For a few peaceful moments, the entire village seemed to pause. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because everyone understood that days like these were meant to be remembered. As the evening grew a little cooler, families slowly began preparing for the journey home. Some carried small bundles from the marketplace, a loaf of fresh bread, a length of woven cloth, perhaps a small wooden toy, carefully tucked beneath a child's arm. The village square gradually became quieter. The storyteller folded away his well-worn books. The musicians carefully packed their instruments. The potter covered his unfinished work. The blacksmith allowed the final embers of his forge to fade. One by one, the market stalls disappeared. Only faint footprints remained upon the well-trodden earth. Tomorrow, the square would once again become an ordinary place. Farmers would cross it before sunrise. Children would hurry past on simple errands. Merchants would continue their long journeys toward distant towns. Yet something gentle had changed. For a single day, the village had welcomed the wider world. Stories had been exchanged, old friendships renewed, new memories quietly made. As darkness settled across the countryside, lanterns appeared once more along the winding paths. Neighbors wished one another a peaceful evening. Doors closed softly behind returning families. Only the distant sound of church bells reminded the village that another beautiful festival had become part of memory. Not every celebration in medieval Europe took place in villages like these, beyond the forests, across wide rivers, and behind towering stone walls. Another very different world was preparing to celebrate. The world of castles, where kings, queens, nobles, and great halls welcomed festivals in their own remarkable way. Chapter 4: Festivals Behind Castle Walls. While village festivals were filled with familiar neighbors, the celebrations held inside great castles belonged to a very different world, far beyond the village fields. Stone walls rose above the surrounding countryside. Their towers could be seen from many miles away. Strong, patient, and seemingly unchanged by the passing seasons. As visitors approached, the castle slowly revealed itself. A broad moat surrounded its outer walls. A heavy wooden drawbridge stretched across the water. Beyond it, a pair of enormous oak doors stood open. Guests arrived throughout the morning. Some traveled on horseback. Others came in finely decorated wagons. Noble families greeted one another with quiet courtesy. Servants carefully carried luggage through the great entrance. Stable boys gently led the horses away to be fed and rested. Inside the castle courtyard, the atmosphere was calm, yet quietly busy. Messengers crossed the open space carrying sealed letters. Servants hurried between kitchens and storerooms. Large baskets filled with fresh bread, vegetables, and herbs were delivered throughout the day. From somewhere nearby, the comforting aroma of roasting meat drifted gently through the air. The preparations had begun long before the first guest arrived. Every table had been carefully arranged, every candle prepared, every wooden bench placed exactly where it belonged. Beyond the courtyard, the great hall waited quietly. Its tall ceiling disappeared into dark wooden beams high above. Colorful banners hung from the walls. Large tapestries told stories of kings, battles, and ancient legends. Rows of candles filled the room with a warm golden light. Even during the day, their gentle flames made the hall feel welcoming. At one end, the high table had been prepared for the lord of the castle, his family, and honored guests. Long wooden tables stretched across the hall below, ready to welcome knights, visitors, priests, and trusted friends. Although everything appeared magnificent, the purpose of the gathering remained surprisingly familiar: to welcome others, to share a meal, and to celebrate together. In this way, the great castles and the smallest villages were perhaps not quite so different after all. The first guests slowly found their places. There was no great announcement, no trumpet calling the hall to attention. People simply greeted one another with quiet respect. Old friends exchanged warm smiles. Knights removed their heavy cloaks. Ladies admired one another's finely woven gowns. Children, dressed in their very best clothing, looked around the enormous hall with quiet wonder. As everyone settled, servants moved silently between the tables. Clay cups were carefully placed before each guest. Fresh loaves of bread were arranged inside woven baskets. Small wooden bowls soon followed. Before long, the first dishes began to appear. Large platters of roasted meat, fresh river fish, seasonal vegetables, soft cheeses, butter, and thick slices of warm bread, still carrying the comforting aroma of the ovens. For the wealthiest households, the meal could continue for many hours. One course gently followed another, not hurried, not extravagant for its own sake, but carefully prepared to honor both the guests and the occasion itself. Throughout the hall, conversation rose and fell like a gentle breeze. Some spoke about journeys they had recently completed. Others discussed the coming harvest, the condition of distant roads, or the weather that had shaped the year's crops. Children listened quietly, learning simply by being present. At the far end of the hall, musicians began to play. A harp filled the room with soft melodies. A flute answered gently. Occasionally, a lute joined the music. Their songs never competed with conversation. Instead, they quietly accompanied it, like the steady glow of candlelight. The music became part of the room itself. Outside, the thick stone walls kept the world at a comfortable distance. The sounds of the countryside faded. Only the quiet celebration within the great hall remained. For a few peaceful hours, the castle became more than a place of power. It became a home, filled with warmth, conversation, music, and welcome. As the meal slowly drew toward its close, no one seemed eager to leave their place. The candles continued to burn with a gentle, steady light. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent across the castle walls. Servants quietly cleared empty platters from the tables. Fresh cups were filled once more. Conversation became softer, more thoughtful. Some guests rose to stretch their legs. Others wandered toward the tall windows, looking out across forests, rivers, and distant fields that stretched far beyond the castle grounds. From this great height, the villages below appeared peaceful. Tiny cottages rested among green fields. Thin ribbons of smoke drifted gently into the afternoon sky. Somewhere in the distance, church bells quietly marked another passing hour. For a moment, the difference between castle and village seemed much smaller than it first appeared. Both looked toward the same countryside. Both followed the same changing seasons. Both welcomed the same festivals, year after year. Yet while the banquets slowly came to an end, another part of the celebration was only just beginning. Beyond the great hall, the castle courtyard was gradually filling with people once again. Musicians tuned their instruments. Falconers prepared their birds. And before long, the open space beyond the castle walls would become a place of gentle entertainment. But that is where our journey will continue next. Chapter 4b. The Castle Comes Alive. As the afternoon quietly continued, the celebration gradually moved beyond the great hall. Guests stepped into the wide castle courtyard. The fresh air carried the gentle fragrance of flowering gardens, mixed with the familiar scent of warm stone and freshly cut grass. Servants moved quietly among the gathering, offering cool drinks to those who wished to rest beneath the shade of ancient trees. Not every moment of a noble festival was spent at the banquet table. Much of the afternoon was given to quiet entertainment. Near one side of the courtyard, a small group of musicians had gathered beneath a covered gallery. Their melodies floated gently through the open air. The soft sound of a harp blended with the clear voice of a wooden flute. Occasionally, a lute joined the music. The performances were never hurried. Guests listened while strolling through the gardens. Some paused to admire the flowers. Others simply enjoyed the peaceful company of friends and family. Nearby, a falconer stood patiently beside several magnificent birds. Each wore a finely crafted leather hood, resting calmly upon a gloved hand. To many visitors, these birds were among the most remarkable sights of the day. With a quiet signal, one falcon rose gracefully into the sky. For a few moments, it circled high above the castle towers, before returning with effortless precision to its keeper. The display lasted only a short while, yet many guests remained watching long after it had ended, not because they expected something greater, but because moments of quiet beauty were appreciated just as much as moments of celebration. Elsewhere in the courtyard, children wandered between carefully tended gardens, collecting colorful flowers, watching butterflies drift through the warm afternoon air. The older guests smiled as they passed, for even within the walls of a great castle, simple pleasures were often the ones remembered longest. Not every form of entertainment asked its audience to sit quietly. In another part of the courtyard, a small open space had been carefully prepared. Here, young knights demonstrated the skills they had spent many years learning. There were no great battles, no crowds shouting with excitement. Instead, the displays were careful, measured, and respectful. One rider guided his horse through a series of wooden markers. Another demonstrated remarkable control with a long spear. Nearby, archers quietly practiced their aim. Their arrows traveled with a gentle hiss, before settling into distant straw targets. Between each attempt, there was time to pause, to observe, to learn. Older knights often offered quiet words of encouragement, a slight adjustment of posture, a steadier grip, a calmer breath before releasing the bowstring. These were lessons passed patiently from one generation to the next. Not far away, the castle gardens offered a different kind of peace. Stone paths wound gently between carefully tended flower beds. Small fountains reflected the afternoon sunlight. Fruit trees provided welcome shade. Some guests wandered slowly beneath their branches. Others found quiet benches where they could simply rest, listening to birdsong and the distant music drifting from the courtyard. For many noble families, the greatest luxury was not the feast itself, nor the fine clothing, nor even the great castle surrounding them. It was having the rare opportunity to spend an unhurried afternoon in pleasant company. As the sun continued its slow journey across the sky, the celebrations became quieter once more. The music softened. Conversation slowed. Even the horses resting in the nearby stables seemed content in the peaceful afternoon. The festival, like every beautiful day, was gently moving toward its evening. As the first colors of evening appeared above the castle, the day's celebrations gradually slowed. The musicians played one final melody. Its gentle notes drifted through the open courtyard, before quietly fading into the evening air. Guests wandered once more through the gardens. Some paused beside the ancient stone walls, looking out across the countryside below. From the castle heights, the fields stretched toward the distant horizon. Small villages rested peacefully among forests and rivers. Thin trails of smoke rose from cottage chimneys. The same church bells that welcomed village festivals could sometimes be heard here as well. Their quiet sound reminded everyone that beyond these impressive walls, life continued much as it always had. Farmers still cared for their fields. Millers still turned their wheels. Children still played beneath the same evening sky. Although castles appeared grand, the changing seasons touched noble families, just as surely as they touched everyone else. Spring still brought blossoms. Summer filled the fields with grain. Autumn gathered the harvest. Winter covered the land in silence. The festivals celebrated within castle walls, and those celebrated in the smallest villages, were different in appearance. Yet they often shared the very same purpose: to bring people together, to offer gratitude, to strengthen friendships, and to create memories that would quietly remain long after the candles had burned low. As darkness gently settled across the castle, servants lit lanterns along the stone passages. Doors were closed against the cool night air. One by one, the guests wished each other peaceful evenings. Tomorrow, the castle would once again return to its ordinary rhythm. But tonight, its halls still carried the warmth of another festival, now becoming part of history. Chapter 5: The Harvest and the Turning of the Year. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, the countryside changed once again. The bright greens of spring became fields of gold. The mornings felt cooler. The evenings arrived a little earlier each day. Across medieval Europe, this was one of the busiest seasons of the entire year. For many months, families had worked from sunrise until sunset, planting, weeding, repairing fences, caring for animals, watching the weather with quiet hope. Now, the harvest had finally arrived. Every pair of hands had a purpose. Men carefully gathered the grain. Women tied neat bundles of wheat. Children helped wherever they could. Even the oldest members of the village found small ways to contribute. The work was demanding, yet there was quiet satisfaction in seeing the fields slowly emptied, knowing that another winter's food had been safely gathered. Only when the final wagon returned did the village truly begin to relax. The harvest was complete, and with grateful hearts, the people prepared for another festival. Unlike the joyful freshness of Easter, or the quiet warmth of Christmas. Harvest festivals carried a different feeling. They were filled with thankfulness. Not for wealth, but for enough. Enough grain to bake bread. Enough vegetables to last the winter. Enough hay to feed the animals. Enough hope to face another year. On the morning of the celebration, the church bells once again welcomed the village together. Families gathered to give thanks. Simple prayers filled the little stone church. Outside, the autumn breeze gently stirred the golden leaves. Nature itself seemed to be preparing for rest. When the prayers had quietly come to an end, the celebration slowly spread beyond the church doors. The village square welcomed familiar faces once again. Neighbors greeted one another warmly. Children wandered happily between the gathering families. The busy work of harvesting had finally been set aside. For one peaceful day. There was nowhere else to be. Long wooden tables were carried into the open air. Fresh bread rested beside large wheels of cheese. Bowls of apples, pears, plums, and roasted vegetables filled the tables with the colors of autumn. Warm stews simmered gently above open fires. Their comforting aroma drifted slowly through the crisp afternoon air. Ale was poured into wooden cups, not in great excess, but carefully shared among neighbors and friends. Conversation came easily. Some spoke of the harvest that had just ended. Others quietly remembered years when the weather had been less forgiving. Older villagers offered gentle advice to the younger farmers. Not as lessons, but as memories gathered over many seasons. Nearby, children discovered endless ways to entertain themselves. Some gathered brightly colored leaves beneath ancient oak trees. Others watched squirrels preparing for the long winter ahead. A few simply lay upon the grass, looking up at clouds that drifted peacefully across the autumn sky. No one seemed eager to hurry the day. The fields could wait until tomorrow. Today, the village rested together, enjoying the quiet reward of many months of patient work. As the afternoon slowly slipped toward evening, a gentle stillness settled across the countryside. The warm colors of autumn deepened. Golden fields glowed beneath the lowering sun. The leaves of ancient oaks turned shades of amber, copper, and deep crimson. A cool breeze wandered through the village, carrying with it the familiar scent of fallen leaves, fresh earth, and with smoke rising from distant cottages. The harvest festival was never simply a celebration of food. It was also a quiet moment of gratitude for another season safely completed, for another winter that could now be faced with hope. As the light continued to soften, families began preparing small fires around the edge of the village. Not great roaring bonfires, but welcoming fires, where neighbors gathered close against the cool evening air. Some quietly roasted apples. Others warmed bread beside the glowing embers. Children sat listening as grandparents shared stories from harvests many years before. Stories of seasons when the fields had overflowed with grain. And stories of years when patience and courage had carried the village through more difficult times. Above them, the first stars slowly appeared. One by one, the familiar constellations returned to the autumn sky. Many villagers paused for a moment, simply to look upward. The same stars had watched over their parents and their grandparents. They would continue to shine long after every harvest and every festival had quietly become part of memory. The year was gently drawing toward its close. Winter would soon return. The fields would rest once again. And before long, the church bells would welcome another Christmas. The seasons moved in quiet circles, each one different, yet each one wonderfully familiar, just as they had, for generations beyond counting. As the final evening of the festival gently came to an end, the village slowly returned to silence. The last conversations became quieter. The final lanterns glowed softly outside timber-framed homes. Children, now weary after a long and joyful day, rested peacefully against the shoulders of their parents. The fires gradually settled into glowing embers. Only an occasional crackle disturbed the quiet night. One by one, families began the familiar walk home. The paths they followed were the same paths they traveled every day. Yet somehow, after a festival, they always seemed a little different. Perhaps it was because the memories of the day walked home beside them. The songs they had heard, the stories they had shared, the neighbors they had embraced, the simple comfort of spending time together. Tomorrow, the fields would once again ask for careful hands. The blacksmith's hammer would return to its steady rhythm. The mill wheel would continue turning beside the river. Life, as it always had, would quietly continue. Yet these festivals left something behind. Not something that could be carried in a basket or stored inside a wooden chest, but something far gentler. A feeling of belonging. A reminder that no matter how difficult life could sometimes become, there would always be another season, another gathering, another familiar sound of church bells drifting across the countryside, and another peaceful day, shared with those who mattered most. As we quietly leave medieval Europe behind, the villages become smaller in the distance. The castle towers slowly disappear beyond the hills. The music fades. The candles grow dim. Only the stars remain, watching silently above fields, forests, and quiet country roads, just as they have for countless centuries. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through the festivals of medieval Europe. Wherever this evening finds you, I hope you found a few quiet moments to carry with you. May your home feel warm. May your mind feel peaceful. And may the gentle rhythm of history carry you into a deep and restful sleep. Good night.